All right, this is the part where nothing new really happens, which is perfect. By now, the lights are low. The story has stretched long enough that it's lost its sharp edges. Names blur, dates soften. Everything important has already happened, and yet it keeps happening anyway. That's kind of the point. When we think about the first American colonies, we're taught to see them as a beginning, a clean starting line, a moment where something clearly starts and then moves forward in an orderly way. But that's not how it felt at the time, and it's not how it echoes now. For the people living in those early settlements, there was no origin story. There was just weather, food, debt, neighbors. There were arguments about fences, church seating, who owed what to whom. History, as it turns out, rarely announces itself. The colonies didn't feel historic. They felt inconvenient. Too hot, too cold, too far from home, too close to people who disagreed with you about everything. And that ordinary discomfort is what carried forward. Even now, centuries later, so much of American life still reflects those early conditions. The insistence on local control, the skepticism of authority, the habit of solving problems piecemeal instead of systemically. Those weren't philosophical choices at first. They were survival strategies. If London was months away by ship, you handled things yourself. If help wasn't coming, you improvised. And improvisation hardens into tradition faster than anyone expects. That's why the colonial past feels oddly present, not dramatic, not loud, just embedded. It's in town meetings, in school boards, in the way people argue passionately about small, local issues as if they are defending something sacred. Because, in a way, they are. Those early communities survived by believing that their little corner mattered, and once that belief takes hold, it doesn't leave easily. The colonies were also places of contradiction, idealism alongside exploitation, community alongside exclusion, faith alongside fear. Those contradictions didn't cancel each other out, they coexisted. They still do. Which is why American history often feels unresolved, not because it failed to conclude, but because it was never meant to. It was always a process, not a product. The first colonies didn't set out to create a nation. They set out to endure another winter, to harvest enough food, to keep things from falling apart for one more year. And endurance leaves a different legacy than ambition. It creates patience, stubbornness, a tolerance for discomfort. Sometimes that's admirable. Sometimes it's deeply frustrating. Usually it's both. So when people ask what the colonies meant, the most honest answer might be, they meant to last. That's it. Not to inspire, not to symbolize, not to become textbook chapters, just to keep going. And they did. Long enough to become something else, long enough for their habits to become laws, long enough for their arguments to become institutions, long enough for us to still be listening to them, even when we don't realize it. And now, after all this slow drifting, there's really nothing left to add. The timeline doesn't need pushing anymore. It doesn't need explaining. It can just be. So let the story loosen its grip. Let the names fade completely. Let the events dissolve into a quiet sense of continuity. The first American colonies are not asking to be remembered tonight. They're asking to be left where they belong, in the background, unfinished, still echoing. And that's okay. You don't need to stay awake for history to continue. It always does. So rest. The story has no rush left in it.
Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something very calm, very slow, and only mildly depressing. So go ahead and dim the lights, put your phone face down, adjust the pillow approximately 7 times, and settle in. Because tonight, we begin a very slow history of the first American colonies. This is not the exciting version. There will be no patriotic music swelling in the background, no heroic speeches, no dramatic declarations shouted into the wind. This is the sleepy version, where everyone is tired, underprepared, mildly sick, and mostly confused about where they are, which, honestly, is the most accurate version. So let's gently drift back to the late 1500s and early 1600s, a time when Europe was crowded, smelly, politically messy, and deeply convinced that sailing across a vast, unmapped ocean in wooden boats was a reasonable solution to, well, everything. Europe at this point was not thriving. It was surviving. Barely. There were too many people, not enough land, and everyone was fighting over religion, money, or whose cousin technically owned which muddy field. And, naturally, someone looked at a map, or what passed for a map, saw a huge blank space across the Atlantic, and said, "Sure, let's go there. What's the worst that could happen?" Of course, this was before anyone really understood germs, or nutrition, or weather patterns, or the fact that North America was already very much occupied. But optimism was high, planning was low, and ships were leaving anyway. Now, before we even reach the English colonies, the ones everyone remembers, we need to float past the earlier attempts, the warm-up failures, the practice disasters. Spain, for instance, had already been poking around the Americas for over a century by the time England decided to join the chaos. Spain was very enthusiastic about gold, souls, and claiming things by planting flags and announcing ownership out loud. France was also involved, but in a more relaxed way. They were here to trade fur, make alliances, and generally not try too hard, which, in a strange way, worked better for them. England, meanwhile, was watching all of this with growing jealousy. They had ships, they had ambition, they had a surplus of unemployed men who were either religiously dissatisfied, financially desperate, or both. So England decided it was time to colonize. Slowly, poorly, and with paperwork. One of the earliest English attempts was the Roanoke colony. Ah yes, Roanoke, the colony that disappeared and then became everyone's favorite historical mystery. But honestly, it's only mysterious if you ignore context, which we will not do, because context makes it less exciting and more sleepy. Roanoke was established in the 1880s on an island off what is now North Carolina. It was underfunded, undersupplied, and led by people who were, let's say, confident without being competent. They showed up, built some structures, argued with local indigenous groups, ran low on food, and then asked their governor, John White, to go back to England for supplies. So he did. And then England got distracted by a little thing called the Spanish Armada, which delayed his return by several years. When White finally came back, the colony was gone. Just gone. No bodies, no buildings, just the word Croatoan carved into a post, which sounds spooky, but really just meant they probably moved to live with or near a nearby indigenous group because they were starving, and that seemed like a good idea at the time. And England, instead of following up thoroughly, sort of shrugged and said, well, that didn't work, and then waited a couple decades before trying again. Which brings us, gently and without urgency, to Jamestown. Jamestown was founded in 1607. It was England's first permanent colony in North America. And by permanent, we mean it didn't disappear entirely, not that it was well planned or pleasant. Jamestown was funded by the Virginia Company, a group of investors who thought the New World would quickly make them rich. They imagined gold, they imagined trade, they imagined sending back valuable resources.
What they did not imagine was starvation, disease, and men refusing to work because they believed manual labor was beneath them. The settlers who arrived at Jamestown were not ideal. Many were gentlemen, which in this context meant they had never farmed, never hunted, never built anything more complex than a legal argument. They chose a swampy location because it was easy to defend, and immediately began suffering from malaria, dysentery, and water so bad it probably violated several laws of nature. Food was scarce, relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy were tense, and leadership changed constantly because no one could agree on anything. At one point, the colony entered what became known as the starving time, which sounds dramatic, but was really just months of people slowly realizing they should have learned how to grow corn. They ate rats, they ate shoe leather, they ate things that should not be eaten. And yet, Jamestown survived. Barely. Thanks in part to John Smith, who was energetic, bossy, and deeply convinced that everyone should do exactly what he said. He famously declared that those who did not work would not eat, which was a revolutionary logic at the time. Later, tobacco saved Jamestown, not morally, not physically, but financially. John Rolfe began cultivating tobacco that Europeans actually wanted to smoke, and suddenly Jamestown had a purpose, a grim, addictive, economically viable purpose. And with that, England realized colonies could work if you exploited land, labor, and people just enough. So they tried again, and again, and again. Now let's gently drift northward, very gently, no sudden movements. In 1620, a group known as the Pilgrims arrived in New England aboard the Mayflower. They are often portrayed as cheerful, determined freedom seekers. In reality, they were anxious, deeply religious separatists who were unhappy almost everywhere they went. They did not come seeking religious freedom for everyone. They came seeking religious freedom for themselves, which is a very important distinction. They landed at Plymouth, which was not their intended destination. They were tired, they were cold, they were immediately unprepared for winter. The first winter was brutal. Many died. The survivors were helped by local indigenous people, including Squanto, who spoke English and showed them how to farm in this unfamiliar land. This cooperation is often simplified into a cheerful Thanksgiving story, but it was more complicated and more fragile. Still, the colony survived because help arrived, because crops grew, because desperation breeds adaptability. More Puritans followed, lots more. By the 1630s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was booming, which meant more rules, more laws, more intense moral supervision. These were not relaxed people. They regulated clothing, speech, church attendance, thoughts, if possible. Dissenters were not welcomed, which is ironic considering why they left England. People like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were banished for having ideas that were slightly too independent. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, a colony built on religious tolerance and general chillness by comparison. And just like that, more colonies appeared: Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maryland, each with its own purpose, its own sponsors, and its own problems. Maryland, for instance, was founded as a haven for Catholics, which did not prevent it from immediately experiencing religious conflict, because humans are consistent like that. Meanwhile, further south, colonies were forming with a heavy emphasis on agriculture and labor, which would, unfortunately, become deeply entangled with slavery. But that slow, heavy reality is something we'll drift into later, not tonight. Tonight, we're still in the awkward infancy. These early colonies were fragile. They depended heavily on indigenous knowledge, even as they displaced indigenous communities. They argued constantly. They struggled with food, disease, and governance. They were not united. They were not visionary. They were just surviving. And that survival, slow and uneven, laid the groundwork for everything that followed, not because it was noble, but because it lasted. So as we ease toward the middle of the 16th century, the colonies are still small, still vulnerable, still very much tied to Europe. And no one yet imagines a united nation. They are English subjects, or Dutch traders, or French missionaries. America, as an idea, is still asleep. And that's a good place for us to stay for now, floating, unrushed, uncertain.
All right. Welcome back, or welcome forward. Time is meaningless here. If you fell asleep during the last part, that's ideal. If you didn't, that's also fine. Just get comfortable again. Nothing urgent is about to happen. When we last drifted off, the American colonies were still small, fragile, and emotionally dependent on Europe. They were surviving, not thriving, which for the 1600s counted as a success. Now we slowly glide into the mid-17th century, and this is where things begin to spread, not quickly, not neatly, but outward, like spilled ink or an argument that no one remembers starting. The English colonies began to grow in number and population. More ships arrived, more people disembarked, some hopeful, some desperate, some sent as punishment, which was a whole system England was very proud of. These were not carefully selected pioneers. They were farmers, craftsmen, debtors, indentured servants, and people who had annoyed the wrong authorities back home. Indentured servitude was especially popular. You couldn't afford passage to the New World? No problem. You could just sign away several years of your life, work for someone else, and hope you survive long enough to be free. Many did not. But those who did added to the population, and the colonies began to push outward from the coast, which immediately caused tension because land, once again, was already occupied. The English relationship with indigenous nations varied wildly. Sometimes there were alliances, trade, treaties, and then, inevitably, misunderstandings, broken promises, encroachment, violence. This wasn't usually planned as some grand coordinated effort. It was more like a slow accumulation of bad decisions. Colonists needed land. They took it. Indigenous communities resisted. Colonists responded poorly, and the cycle repeated. One of the earliest major conflicts was the Pequot War in the mid-1630s. It was short, brutal, and deeply unsettling, even by the standards of the time. It ended with the near destruction of the Pequot people, and it set a precedent that would echo quietly but constantly through colonial history. But let's not linger too intensely. Remember, this is the sleepy version, so we acknowledge the darkness and then gently move past it. Back in the colonies themselves, life was structured, especially in New England. Puritan society was rigid, church attendance was mandatory, behavior was monitored, community members were encouraged to report one another for moral failings, which meant everyone was deeply involved in everyone else's business all the time. This led to frequent disputes over doctrine, over behavior, over who was too proud, too lazy, too outspoken, or too relaxed about sin. And, of course, when tension builds in a tightly controlled society, it eventually finds an outlet.
Sometimes that outlet was banishment, sometimes it was public shaming, and sometimes it was accusations of witchcraft. But we're not quite there yet. That particular disaster is still warming up in the wings. Further south, the colonies were developing very differently. Virginia and Maryland leaned heavily into plantation agriculture. Tobacco was king, and tobacco demanded labor. At first, that labor came from indentured servants, but over time, colonists turned increasingly toward enslaved Africans. This shift happened gradually, quietly, with laws that hardened year by year until slavery became racialized, permanent, and hereditary. No big announcement, no single moment, just a slow, bureaucratic descent into something very dark. And because this was profitable, it spread. By the late 1600s, slavery was deeply embedded in the southern colonies and increasingly present in the northern ones as well, though often hidden behind trade and shipping. The colonies were not morally unified, they were economically motivated, and economics has a way of dulling discomfort. Meanwhile, England was distracted. The English Civil War erupted in the 1640s. King Charles I lost his head, literally, which was considered very shocking at the time. For the colonies, this was confusing. Who were they loyal to now? The king? Parliament? Someone else entirely? Most colonies tried to stay out of it. They had enough problems already. After the monarchy was restored under Charles II, England looked back across the Atlantic and realized something important. The colonies were getting a little too independent, too comfortable, too used to making their own decisions. So England tightened control. Navigation acts were passed, trade was restricted, goods had to flow through English ports, taxes were enforced. The colonies complied, mostly, sometimes. Smuggling became common because it was easier and cheaper, and everyone pretended not to notice. This uneasy balance, control from afar, autonomy on the ground, defined colonial life. Colonists still saw themselves as English. They wanted the rights of Englishmen. They wanted protection. They wanted trade. But they also wanted to be left alone, which is a very human contradiction. As populations grew, so did towns, and with towns came taverns, and with taverns came arguments. Colonial assemblies formed, local governments developed. People got used to voting, debating, and disagreeing loudly. Not democracy as we imagine it today, but something adjacent. Women, indigenous people, enslaved people, none of them had a say, but within a narrow group of property-owning men, political habits were forming, and habits are hard to break. Let's gently float north again. By the late 1600s, New England was stable enough to start producing something other than food and sermons. They built ships, they fished, they traded. Boston became a hub, busy, noisy, full of opinions. Further inland, frontier settlements pushed into forests. Life there was harsher, more isolated. People relied on neighbors, distrusted outsiders, and developed a quiet resilience mixed with suspicion. And through all of this, the colonies remained deeply uneven. New York, originally Dutch, retained a more diverse, tolerant atmosphere. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, leaned into Quaker ideals of tolerance and fairness. Penn actually tried to maintain peaceful relations with indigenous peoples, and for a time it worked, which proved that different approaches were possible. They just weren't always chosen. As the 17th century slowly wound down, the colonies were no longer experiments. They were established societies, messy, unequal, contradictory. They had churches, courts, farms, ports, and families who had never known England. Children were being born who thought of this land as home, not opportunity, not exile, home. And that subtle shift, that quiet generational change, mattered more than any law or battle. Because once people stop thinking of themselves as temporary guests, they start expecting permanence. And permanence comes with expectations. But for now, those expectations were still quiet, still unformed. The colonies were still loyal, still dependent, still very much part of an empire. And so we'll leave them here. Not rebellious yet, just settled.
All right, let's ease back in. No sudden awakenings, no loud historical events jumping out at us. Just settle back into the timeline like it's an old couch that remembers your shape. By the early 1700s, the American colonies were comfortable. Not wealthy across the board, not equal, not peaceful everywhere, but comfortable enough to start complaining about things that were not immediately life-threatening. And historically speaking, that's a big step. The colonies now stretched from New England down through the Chesapeake and into the Carolinas. Georgia would arrive later, fashionably late, like the youngest sibling trying to prove it belonged. Population numbers were climbing, families were growing. People were being born, aging, and dying without ever seeing Europe. And that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because once a society starts reproducing itself locally, it stops feeling temporary, it stops feeling borrowed, and it starts developing opinions. Colonial life in the early 18th century had a rhythm to it. In New England, towns revolved around churches, schools, and meetings where men gathered to discuss issues with an intensity that suggests there wasn't a lot else to do. Education was valued. Literacy was high, mostly so people could read the Bible correctly and argue about it. In the middle colonies, places like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, diversity was the norm. Different languages, different religions, different customs. These colonies were busier, more commercially minded, more tolerant out of necessity. Further south, plantation society had fully settled in. Large estates, cash crops, enslaved labor doing the work that made everything else possible. White elites lived comfortably, sometimes extravagantly, and with a deep sense of entitlement. Enslaved Africans lived under constant control, violence, and restriction. Families were broken apart, cultures were suppressed, and yet traditions survived, quietly, resilient, unnoticed by those benefiting from the system. This imbalance was already baked in. No one was pretending it was temporary anymore. Meanwhile, Britain was doing what empires do best, fighting wars, accumulating debt, and expecting colonies to help pay for it. Throughout the early 1700s, Britain was involved in a series of global conflicts, mostly with France, sometimes with Spain, occasionally with anyone who looked at them wrong. These wars had names like King William's War and Queen Anne's War, which tells you exactly who was in charge at the time. For the colonies, these wars were distant but not irrelevant. They affected trade, they affected security, they sometimes brought fighting to the frontier. Colonial militias were raised, men drilled, supplies were gathered, and colonists got used to defending themselves, which is another habit that's hard to unlearn. At the same time, Britain practiced something historians later called salutary neglect, which is a very polite way of saying they didn't pay close attention. As long as the colonies made money and didn't cause problems, Britain was happy to let them run themselves. Colonial assemblies passed laws, collected taxes, argued with royal governors. And because enforcement was loose, colonists learned how to bend rules. Smuggling was common. Everyone knew someone who knew someone. This created a culture of quiet independence. Not rebellion, just autonomy. People handled their own affairs. They solved local problems. They trusted local leaders more than distant ones. And London was very far away. Religion also continued to evolve. By the 1730s and 1740s, the colonies experienced what became known as the Great Awakening, which was essentially a wave of emotional, dramatic religious revivals. Preachers traveled from town to town. They spoke passionately. They told people they needed personal, emotional connections to God. This upset established churches, which preferred things orderly and predictable. The Great Awakening encouraged people to question authority, to trust their own experiences, to challenge tradition, which, again, was not immediately revolutionary, but it planted a seed, a very quiet seed, that would take decades to grow. Social mobility was also more possible in the colonies than in Europe. Land was more available. Rigid class structures were weaker. A man could arrive poor and eventually own property. Not everyone did, but the possibility existed. And possibility changes expectations. Colonists began to see themselves as different from people back in Britain. Not better, just different. More practical, more self-reliant, less interested in aristocratic nonsense. They still admired British culture, they still followed British fashions, but there was a growing sense that they knew what worked for them. This quiet confidence sat beneath daily life. By the mid-18th century, cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were thriving. Ports were busy, newspapers circulated, ideas moved faster. People talked, they debated, they complained, and complaining in particular became something of a hobby. Then came the war that changed everything, the French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, because Europeans love naming wars after how long they ruin things. This conflict erupted in the 1750s. It was massive, global, expensive. In North America, it was fought between British forces and French forces, along with their indigenous allies. Colonists fought alongside British troops. They provided supplies. They lost lives. And when Britain finally won, they won big. France lost most of its North American territory. Britain emerged as the dominant power on the continent. But victory came with a problem. Debt. A lot of it. And Britain looked at the colonies and thought, well, they benefited from this. They should help pay for it. Which, on paper, makes sense. But context matters. The colonies had grown used to managing their own finances, their own taxes, their own assemblies. And Britain, suddenly paying attention again, began passing new laws, new taxes, new regulations. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, more enforcement of trade laws. And colonists did not like this. Not because they were taxed at all, but because they were taxed without representation. They had assemblies, they had votes, they had opinions, and Parliament, thousands of miles away, did not include them. So protests began, peaceful at first, mostly. Boycotts, pamphlets, meetings. Colonists insisted they were loyal subjects. They just wanted fairness. Britain, confused and annoyed, alternated between backing down and doubling down, repealing one tax, introducing another, and tension slowly, steadily increased. But we are not rushing toward revolution yet, not tonight, because revolutions do not start with explosions. They start with irritation, with letters, with arguments, with people saying, "This isn't right," and then saying it again and again and again. So we leave the colonies here, prosperous enough to care, confident enough to question, still loyal, still British, but no longer passive.
All right, ease back in. Same timeline, same uneasy calm. If you dozed off somewhere around the Great Awakening or the French and Indian War, that's perfect. You didn't miss the vibe. The vibe is still irritated, but polite. When we left the colonies, they were standing at an awkward moment in history. They had just helped Britain win a massive war, they had expanded security, they had eliminated France as a nearby imperial threat, and in return, Britain handed them a bill. Not all at once. That would have been rude, but slowly, carefully, with paperwork. The first real spark was the Stamp Act of 1765. This tax required colonists to purchase official stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, and various other everyday items, which meant that suddenly almost everything important cost more. And more importantly, it was imposed directly by Parliament. No colonial assembly involvement, no local approval, just a decision from far away. Colonists reacted badly. Not violently at first, but loudly. Pamphlets appeared, meetings were held, speeches were given. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," began floating around. Not shouted yet, just repeated, over and over. Some protests were more theatrical. Effigies were burned, tax collectors were intimidated, crowds gathered. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged, which sounds dramatic but was mostly men standing around being very upset together. Britain, surprised by the intensity of the backlash, repealed the Stamp Act. Colonists celebrated. And then Britain immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which calmly stated that Parliament still had the right to tax the colonies whenever it wanted. So that was reassuring. More taxes followed. The Townshend Acts placed duties on goods like glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Colonists boycotted British goods. Merchants complained. Smuggling increased. British troops were sent to enforce order, especially in Boston, which turned out to be a bad idea, because nothing calms a tense situation like soldiers occupying your city. Boston became crowded with redcoats. Colonists resented them. Soldiers resented the colonists. Arguments broke out. Insults were exchanged. And in 1770, one of these confrontations turned deadly. The Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed. Not a massacre by modern standards, but the name stuck because it was useful. Patriots used it as propaganda. Images circulated. Stories spread. British soldiers were put on trial, defended by John Adams of all people, because the rule of law still mattered. Most were acquitted, but the damage was done. Trust eroded further. Britain once again tried to calm things down. Most of the Townshend duties were repealed, except for one: tea. Because tea mattered, symbolically, economically, emotionally. Which brings us to 1773. The Tea Act was meant to help the struggling British East India Company. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, which sounds nice. Cheaper tea, what's not to like? Well, it still included a tax, and it still came from Parliament. Colonists didn't want cheaper tea, they wanted control. So in Boston, a group of colonists dressed up as indigenous people, because symbolism was subtle, boarded ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party. No one was hurt, nothing else was damaged, just a lot of soggy tea. Britain was not amused. Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts, because branding matters. These laws punished Massachusetts. They closed Boston Harbor, limited self-government, allowed troops to be quartered more easily. And suddenly, it wasn't just Boston's problem. Other colonies watched this unfold and thought, oh, that could be us next. So they talked, and then they met. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They did not declare independence. They did not plan a war. They petitioned the king. They asked for their rights. They coordinated boycotts. They still wanted reconciliation, but they were preparing for the possibility that reconciliation might not happen. Meanwhile, militias began training more seriously. Weapons were gathered. Supplies were stored. Not for rebellion, just in case. Britain, interpreting this as defiance, sent troops to seize colonial weapons,
and in April 1775, British soldiers marched toward Lexington and Concord. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first, but it didn't really matter, because once it happened, things moved quickly. Militia forces resisted, British troops retreated to Boston, and suddenly the colonies were at war with the empire they had once proudly served. Still, even now, independence wasn't guaranteed. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain. Others were unsure. Most were just trying to survive. The Second Continental Congress convened. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army, which was optimistic because the army barely existed. It lacked supplies, training, uniforms, but it had determination and local support. And slowly, the idea of independence gained traction. Thomas Paine published Common Sense in 1776. It was blunt, accessible, and extremely persuasive. He argued that monarchy was absurd, that an island should not rule a continent, and people listened. Public opinion shifted. By the summer of 1776, independence no longer felt impossible. It felt necessary. But we're going to stop here, right at the edge, before declarations, before fireworks, before everything changes permanently. Because the moment before something breaks is often the quietest. The colonies are nervous, determined, divided, and history is holding its breath.
All right. Welcome back. Same slow pace, same low lighting, same historical anxiety humming quietly in the background. When we last left the colonies, shots had been fired, tempers were high, and everyone was insisting they didn't want a full break. They just kept doing things that made a full break increasingly unavoidable. By early 1776, the situation was deeply awkward. The colonies were already fighting British troops, people were dying, armies were forming, and yet, officially, they were still claiming loyalty to King George III, which is a strange emotional place to be. Imagine actively fighting someone while insisting you still respect them. That was the mood. The Second Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. Again, they met a lot. They debated, they disagreed, they worried endlessly about consequences. Because declaring independence wasn't just symbolic, it was dangerous. If they failed, they wouldn't be rebels, they'd be traitors. And Britain was very clear about how it felt about traitors. Still, momentum was building. Common sense had spread like wildfire. People read it aloud in taverns. They argued about it in homes. The idea that monarchy itself was ridiculous began to feel reasonable. King George III, meanwhile, was not helping his image. He rejected colonial petitions, declared the colonies in rebellion, sent more troops, and with that, many undecided colonists quietly crossed a mental line. So in June of 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration, a document explaining why the colonies were leaving. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft because he was articulate, confident, and had very strong opinions about things. He wrote about natural rights, equality, liberty. He also included a section condemning slavery, which was immediately removed because compromises were already being made. The final document was edited, argued over, softened in places, and on July 4, 1776, it was adopted, the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't a dramatic public announcement at first. No fireworks, no cheering crowds. It was read aloud, printed, distributed, and quietly the colonies crossed a point of no return. They were no longer protesting, they were separating. The war, already happening, now had meaning, and it was not going well. The Continental Army struggled constantly. Supplies were scarce, food was limited, uniforms were inconsistent. Soldiers lacked shoes, training, pay. Desertion was common. George Washington held the army together mostly through persistence and patience. He lost battles, a lot of them. New York fell quickly. British forces were stronger, better equipped, better trained. The British assumed the rebellion would collapse on its own. It didn't. Because even when things looked bleak, the colonies didn't stop. Washington crossed the Delaware River in the winter of 1776, surprised Hessian troops at Trenton. It was a small victory, but psychologically important. It reminded everyone that the war was still possible, and possibility matters. France watched all of this closely. They still resented Britain, still remembered losing North American territory. At first, they provided quiet support, money, supplies. Eventually, after the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, France openly joined the war, which changed everything. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just fighting a rebellion, it was fighting a global conflict again. The war dragged on. Battles happened in the north, then shifted south. Loyalists and patriots clashed. Families were divided, communities fractured. This was not a clean, unified revolution. It was messy, personal, exhausting. Enslaved people were caught in the middle. Some fled to British lines where freedom was promised and not always delivered. Others were forced to support whichever side controlled their region. Native nations were also drawn in, choosing sides, losing land regardless. The rhetoric of liberty did not extend evenly. And yet the idea of independence kept moving forward, slowly, relentlessly. By 1781, British forces under General Cornwallis found themselves trapped at Yorktown. American and French forces surrounded them. The French Navy blocked escape. After weeks of pressure, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. Not immediately, but the outcome was clear. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized American independence. And just like that, very quietly, the colonies became something else, the United States of America. Which sounded impressive, but was in reality deeply uncertain. There was no king now, no empire, just a loose collection of states held together by a weak central government. The Articles of Confederation governed the new nation. They emphasized state power, limited federal authority. Which made sense. Everyone was afraid of centralized control. Unfortunately, it also made governing very difficult. Congress couldn't tax, couldn't enforce laws effectively. The country struggled with debt, trade disputes, internal unrest. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts highlighted the problem. Farmers protested taxes and debt. The government struggled to respond. And leaders realized something uncomfortable. Winning independence was easier than running a country. So in 1787, delegates met again, this time to revise the Articles. They ended up doing something more dramatic. They wrote a new constitution. It created a stronger federal government with checks and balances. It was debated, defended, criticized, ratified reluctantly by the states. And the Bill of Rights was added to protect individual liberties. And slowly, the framework of a nation took shape. Not perfectly, not evenly, but enough to function. So here we are, from fragile colonies clinging to survival to a republic trying to define itself. It wasn't smooth, It wasn't noble all the way through. It was cautious, contradictory, human, and very, very slow. That's where we'll rest. The first American colonies are no longer colonies. They are something new, still unfinished, still uneven, but awake now. And that's a good place to let history drift. So take a breath, let the timeline fade. Nothing more needs to happen tonight.
All right. Settle back in again. The revolution is technically over, but no one feels particularly relaxed about it yet. This is the part where history exhales and then realizes it still has responsibilities. When we last drifted off, the colonies had officially become the United States of America, which sounds very complete, very final. It was not. Because winning independence and knowing what to do with it are two very different skills. The war ended, the British left, and suddenly there was no empire to blame for problems anymore, which is always an uncomfortable transition. The new nation was tired, deeply in debt, politically fragile. Soldiers returned home expecting pay that often didn't exist. Farmers returned to fields that had been neglected. Trade routes were disrupted. Celebrations faded quickly into paperwork. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was intentionally weak, very weak. Congress could ask states for money, states could say no, and frequently did. There was no executive branch to enforce laws, no national court system to settle disputes. States printed their own money, which varied wildly in value. Interstate trade was chaotic. Tariffs popped up between neighbors. Old colonial rivalries resurfaced. Everyone agreed they wanted liberty. They just disagreed on how much coordination that required. George Washington, who had resigned his military command and gone home, a very dramatic and intentional move, watched all of this with growing concern. He did not want to be king, but he also didn't want the country to collapse immediately after independence, and it was wobbling. One of the clearest signs of trouble was Shays' Rebellion in 1786. In western Massachusetts, farmers struggled with debt, high taxes, and aggressive courts. Many were veterans. Many felt betrayed. They organized, they protested, they shut down courts to prevent foreclosures. The state militia eventually restored order, but the message was clear. The government couldn't handle internal unrest effectively. And this scared people, especially wealthy people, which is historically very motivating. So calls grew louder for reform. Not revolution again, just adjustment. In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, they knew revision wasn't going to be enough. The meetings were held in secrecy, windows closed, guards posted, partly to encourage honesty, partly because Philadelphia's summers are unbearable. These men argued a lot. Big states wanted representation based on population, small states did not. Slave states wanted enslaved people counted for representation, but not for rights, which led to the infamous compromises. The Great Compromise created a bicameral legislature, one house based on population, one with equal representation. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation, a morally hollow solution, but politically convenient. Compromises piled up, because unity required agreement, and agreement required overlooking some things. Eventually, a new constitution emerged. It outlined a federal government with 3 branches, checks and balances, shared power. Strong enough to function, limited enough to feel safe, at least in theory. Ratification was not guaranteed. Many feared the new government would become too powerful, too similar to what they had just escaped. Debates erupted across the states. Federalists argued for ratification. Anti-Federalists demanded protections. Out of this tension came the Bill of Rights. 10 amendments guaranteeing freedoms: speech, religion, press, assembly. Added not because everyone agreed, but enough people insisted. By 1789, the Constitution was ratified and the new government began. George Washington was elected the first president, unanimously, which sounds impressive, but also suggests no one else wanted the job. He approached it cautiously, deliberately, setting precedents, establishing norms. 2 terms, then done. A quiet reminder that power could be temporary. Meanwhile, the nation continued expanding. Settlers moved west, into lands promised, traded, or taken. Conflicts with native nations continued. Treaties were signed, broken, signed again. The pattern persisted. Economically, the country stabilized slowly. Alexander Hamilton pushed for a strong financial system, national bank, assumption of state debts. Thomas Jefferson hated this with enthusiasm. Political factions formed. Federalists, Democratic Republicans, not official parties yet, but definitely sides. And once sides exist, arguments follow. The early republic was not unified. It was cautious, opinionated, still experimenting. But the colonial period, that long, awkward beginning, was finally over. The mindset had shifted. No longer subjects, now citizens. Imperfectly defined, unevenly applied, but different. So when we look back at the first colonial colonies, it's tempting to see them as inevitable steps towards nationhood. They weren't. They were fragile, accidental, often poorly planned. They survived through luck, persistence, exploitation, and compromise. They argued constantly, failed repeatedly, adapted slowly. And somehow, through all of that, they lasted long enough to become something else, something unfinished. And that unfinished quality, that's where the story really begins. But for tonight, we stop here. The colonies have become a country. The experiment is underway. And history, never in a hurry, is still moving forward. So rest.
All right. Welcome back again. Same slow breathing, same steady voice, the kind that doesn't demand attention so much as quietly occupy the room. By now, the United States has been a country for a while, long enough to develop traditions, long enough to argue about them, and long enough for the colonial past to stop feeling like the beginning and start feeling like something buried. But buried things don't disappear. They just press upward over time. So as we drift through the mid to late 19th century, it becomes clear that the early colonial mindset never really left. It just changed clothes. The Civil War comes and goes, slowly at first, then all at once. And when it's over, slavery is abolished, on paper, legally, formally. But the structures that supported it don't vanish overnight, because systems, like colonies, are stubborn. Reconstruction attempts to rebuild the South, to integrate formerly enslaved people into civic life, to redefine citizenship. It is ambitious, uneven, resisted at every turn. Federal troops enforce new laws, then they leave, and local power reasserts itself. Jim Crow laws emerge, voting is restricted, segregation becomes normalized, which is colonial logic again, just internalized. A ruling group maintaining control through law, custom, and quiet intimidation. Meanwhile, the country continues expanding west. Railroads stretch across the continent. Towns appear almost overnight, disappear just as fast. Land is claimed, sold, worked. Native nations are confined to reservations. Promises are broken again. The frontier closes officially in the 1890s, which doesn't mean expansion stops. It just moves outward. The United States begins acquiring territories: Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, sometimes through war, sometimes through negotiation that feels suspiciously one-sided. And suddenly the former colonies are managing colonies of their own, carefully avoiding the word, calling them territories instead, insisting it's different, because it's always different when you're the one doing it. Back home, industry reshapes daily life. Factories, time clocks, mass production. Immigration surges. People arrive from Europe, Asia, and beyond, seeking work, stability, a version of the promise. They bring languages, customs, food. Cities become crowded, loud, restless. And once again the question arises: who belongs? Who gets rights? Who gets counted? These questions echo the earliest colonial debates, just with more people involved. The 20th century arrives. Wars happen, globally, violently. The United States becomes a world power, economically, militarily. And with power comes influence. Bases overseas, interventions, alliances. The logic is familiar. Protect interests, expand reach, maintain control. But now the scale is larger, and the language more polished. At home, movements challenge old assumptions. Women demand the vote, and get it. Civil rights activists challenge segregation and slowly dismantle legal barriers. Labor movements push back against exploitation. Each struggle reveals the same pattern. Rights are rarely granted freely. They are demanded, persistently, just like the colonists once demanded theirs. The irony is impossible to miss, and history, never subtle, doesn't bother hiding it. By the late 20th century, the United States is a nation constantly referencing its founding, its colonies, its revolution, as justification, as inspiration, as warning. The early American colonies have become mythologized, simplified, romanticized. The hunger, the failure, the compromise, smoothed over. But underneath the myth, the reality still hums. The colonies were experiments, messy ones, built by people who didn't agree, didn't plan well, and didn't always know what they were doing. Which honestly explains a lot, because that uncertainty never fully resolved. It just scaled up. So when we talk about a very slow history of the first American colonies, we're not really talking about a beginning. We're talking about a pattern. Trial and error, expansion and resistance, ideals colliding with reality, over and over. The colonies weren't just the start of a country. They were the rehearsal. And the performance, well, it's still going. So this is where we let the timeline loosen completely. No neat ending, no final lesson, just a long, continuous drift, from tentative settlements on a distant shore to a nation still negotiating with its origins, still shaped by choices made centuries ago, still arguing with ghosts. And that's all right. History doesn't need closure to be interesting. It just needs patience. So let your thoughts slow. Let the past fade into background noise. Nothing needs to resolve tonight. The colonies have done their work, and we can finally rest.
All right. This is the last stretch. Not a conclusion exactly, more like the lights slowly dimming while the room stays the same. By now, the timeline has stretched so far behind us that it barely feels like a line anymore, more like a haze, a low, steady presence. And that's fitting, because the story of the first American colonies was never meant to end with a firm stop. It was always meant to dissolve. If you go all the way back, not to dates, but to feelings, you find the same ones repeating. Uncertainty, hope mixed with anxiety, the quiet belief that tomorrow might work out if today doesn't fall apart. The first colonists didn't think in centuries, they thought in seasons. Could we get through this winter? Could the crops survive? Could we avoid angering the neighbors, the authorities, or God, preferably all three? That short-term thinking shaped everything. It created communities that valued practicality over polish, habit over theory, experience over ideals. And even when ideals arrived later, liberty, equality, self-rule, they were filtered through that earlier mindset. Big ideas, yes, but applied cautiously, unevenly, often reluctantly. Because the colonies taught people something very early, that survival comes first. Everything else negotiates around it. So when the colonies became a nation, they didn't shed that instinct. They carried it forward. You can still see it in the way American history moves. Rarely in clean arcs, almost never according to plan. Instead, it lurches, pauses, argues with itself. Progress happens, then stalls, then resumes in a different direction. That rhythm, advance, resist, adjust, began long before independence. It began when small settlements tried to hold themselves together with limited resources and unlimited opinions. And those opinions mattered, even when they were small, even when they were wrong, because arguing meant participation, and participation created attachment. People argued because they cared about land, about rules, about belonging. And once people care deeply about a place, they don't leave easily. That's how the colonies endured, not through harmony, but through stubbornness, through people refusing to give up on deeply flawed systems because those systems were theirs. That sense of ownership, emotional, not just legal, outlasted empires. So when we let the story finally rest, we don't need a moral. History isn't a lesson here, it's a condition. The first American colonies were the first version of something that keeps rewriting itself. They were incomplete, so is everything that followed. They were contradictory, so is everything that followed. They were built by people trying their best one day and making things worse the next, so is everything that followed. And somehow, that's comforting, because it means confusion is not failure, it's tradition. The first American colonies didn't know where they were headed. They just knew they had arrived somewhere unfamiliar and needed to figure it out together, or not together, but near each other. And that uncertainty never really resolved. It just became quieter, more routine, less alarming. So now, as the story finally fades out, there's nothing left to hold on to. No final moment, no decisive ending, just continuity. The kind that doesn't wake you up, the kind that hums softly in the background and lets you rest. History will keep moving, it always does, but you don't have to follow it tonight. The colonies are done speaking. The timeline has gone still, and you can let it all drift away.
All right. If you're still here, that's fine. If you drifted in and out somewhere around part 8 or 9, that's even better. This part doesn't need your full attention. This is the place where the story stops moving forward at all. Not because it's finished, but because it no longer needs momentum. By now, the first American colonies are no longer events. They're texture, background noise, the faint outline beneath everything else. They've done all the work they were ever going to do. They planted habits, they normalized arguments, they taught people how to live with uncertainty and still keep going. And once those lessons were learned, history didn't need to repeat the details anymore. That's why when people argue about the present, they often sound strangely familiar. Different words, same rhythms. Local control versus distant authority. Freedom versus order. Belonging versus exclusion. These weren't invented later. They were practiced early, quietly, casually, between ordinary people who didn't think of themselves as founders of anything. They were just tired settlers, farmers, merchants, parents, neighbors, trying to make decisions that felt reasonable at the time. And that's the part that tends to get lost. The colonies were not built by people who knew how the story ended. They were built by people who assumed there wasn't a story, just tomorrow and then the day after that. Which is why their choices feel unfinished, because they were. They weren't crafting legacy, they were buying time. And time, once bought, keeps accumulating. Eventually, it piles up into institutions, borders, traditions, and then someone later calls it history. But from the inside, it never felt like that. It felt like routine. And routine is gentle, predictable, reassuring, even when it's flawed. So if you imagine the first American colonies now, don't picture dramatic landings or grand speeches. Picture quiet evenings, low voices, tired people sitting down after long days, candles burning low, doors closing, the world narrowing to a single room. That's where history actually lived, not in moments of excitement, but in the repetition that followed. And repetition is very good at putting people to sleep. So we let the story do what it's always wanted to do. We let it fade. No more expansion, no more conclusions, no more meaning extracted from it. Just a long exhale. The colonies have become distant enough now that they no longer demand interpretation. They're just there, like a memory you don't need to revisit. And you don't need to stay awake to honor them. History doesn't mind being unattended. It existed before us. It will continue without us. So rest. The timeline has nothing left to say tonight.
All right, this is truly the last place the story can go. Not forward, not backward, just softer. By now, the idea of the first American colonies isn't even an idea anymore. It's a sensation, a faint awareness that something once began, slowly, without confidence, and never fully stopped unfolding. There's nothing left to explain. The names are gone. The dates have slipped away. Even the arguments have lost their edges. All that remains is the rhythm. Arrival, adjustment, endurance. Over and over. That's what the colonies were. Not a spark, not a grand origin, just a long adjustment to unfamiliar ground. People waking up each day and realizing, again, that this place was still theirs to figure out. And that realization never really left. It softened with time. It became background expectation, but it stayed. Which is why the present always feels slightly provisional, like things are still being worked out, like decisions are temporary, even when they last a very long time. That feeling didn't come from modern chaos. It came from the earliest settlements, where nothing felt permanent, yet everything had to be treated as if it were. Homes built knowing they might not last, laws written knowing they might need revision, communities formed knowing they might fracture.
And still, people committed. Not because they were sure, but because uncertainty was the only option available. So if there's any final truth hiding in this very slow history, it's not about success or failure. It's about continuation. The colonies continued. The nation continued. The arguments continued. And continuation, when stretched long enough, becomes familiar enough to feel calm. That's why even now, the past doesn't shout. It murmurs. It hums quietly underneath everything, never asking to be resolved, never demanding attention, just present. So we let it be present without listening anymore. The timeline can keep moving. It doesn't need narration. The colonies have finished telling us what they know. They don't need interpretation. They don't need judgment. They only needed time, and they had it. Now the room is quiet. The story has thinned out completely. Nothing new is forming. This is the stillness after history stops trying to teach anything. You don't need to remember how it began. You don't need to care where it led. The beginning has folded into everything else, and that's enough. So let the past fade all the way into background silence. No more parts, no more drifting. Just rest. The colonies are asleep now.
All right. If this part exists at all, it exists in the same way a final breath exists. Not necessary, not dramatic, just natural. By now, the story isn't really a story anymore. It's settled into the room, like furniture you no longer notice, like a clock you stopped hearing hours ago. The first American colonies have fully let go of their edges. There's no coastline anymore, no ships arriving, no arguments beginning or ending, just a long sense of after. And that's fitting, because history doesn't actually conclude. It simply becomes quiet enough that we stop engaging with it directly. The colonies did not disappear. They dissolved into habits, into language, into assumptions that feel too ordinary to question. The way communities expect to govern themselves, the way people argue about fairness as if it's personal, the way land still feels emotionally charged even when no one remembers why. Those are colonial leftovers, not dramatic ones, domestic ones. They live in routines, meetings that drag on too long, rules that exist because they always have, disagreements that feel ancient even when they're brand new. The colonies taught people how to live with unfinished business, and that lesson stuck better than any speech ever could. That's why the past often feels unresolved, not broken, just open-ended. And open-ended things are easier to rest with once you stop expecting them to close. The early settlers didn't expect closure. They expected continuity. Enough food, enough peace, enough stability to try again tomorrow. That expectation carried forward, quietly shaping everything that followed. So if we zoom out far enough, far past dates, far past outcomes, what remains is not a nation or an empire or a revolution. It's a habit of persistence, a willingness to sit inside uncertainty without demanding resolution, which, ironically, makes this the calmest possible ending. Nothing is being decided anymore. Nothing is being explained. The story has reached a place where it no longer needs attention to exist. It will continue in the background. It always has. And you don't need to be awake for that. You don't need to remember which part this was or why it came after the last one. This isn't progression anymore. It's rest. So let the timeline flatten completely. No beginning, no middle, no end. Just a long, even stillness where the past and present stop feeling separate. The colonies are not calling out. They are not instructing. They're simply quiet. and that quiet doesn't need company. So you can let go now. The story isn't waiting for anything else.